Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today's is mostly an audio experience and we're going to be entirely focused on the narrative review of The Last of Us Part 2. And my reasoning there is that the narrative is the primary thing that people actually care about when it comes to this IP. Now quickly I want to note here that dark, grim, bleak content is actually right up my alley. I have a bias towards it, the likes of Mr. Robot, Battlestar Galactica, the last two games directed by Neil Druckmann, all things that I absolutely love. Now, to pay a bit of lip service to the other things, look, the gameplay here, it's a strong evolution. It's fundamentally the same, though. The acting and the music are essentially perfect. The acting is just exquisite the entire way through, with the music, great additions from Matt Quayle as well, which I really liked. And the visuals, the vistas, it's all perfection, essentially. It's beautiful. But of course, it's the story that is really the thing that people will care about here, and that is what I'm going to be focusing on today. We'll do a little bit of my general main thrust of my opinions without clear spoilers, and then we'll jump into the more spoiler-focused content, including, well, the twist at the end. Essentially, the big twist at the end that is a bit of sleight of hand, I would say, from the writers, where they purposefully withhold a bit of key information from the inciting incident at the start of the game, and, well, let's just say it rubbed me a bit of the wrong way, and it felt a bit disingenuous and honestly a little bit lazy in terms of getting their emotional punch at the end without really deserving it as much. So let's get into the main thrust of things. This game, I think, collapses under the weight of its own ambition, and I get that's a very boilerplate criticism to say, but look, I truly understand what they're trying to do here, okay? They want the player to care deeply about the inciting incident, I'll just call it that for now, and that will lead the player on a revenge quest that they feel deeply about, right? And having the player, through that revenge quest, do things that make them feel uncomfortable. And then what does Naughty Dog want to do? Well, they want to flip it over to your enemy being a second protagonist. I think that's a daring move, and to humanize that character is a laudable goal. However, I think the Naughty Dog have actually just bitten off more than they can chew here, and they did not really execute that narrative all that well, and I think they did not really succeed in their objectives. And yes, they may have bitten off more than they can chew in a desire to make video games do what they haven't done as much before, but ultimately I'll say this, a story is a story. I'm going to critique it like that, whether it is a video game, whether it's film, whether it's television. Essentially, this game's story is one of paper-thin characters stuck in their loop. They're doing predictable things, and you are essentially just there watching them. You have characters like Dinah and Jesse, who could have been great characters, but they just were not fleshed out enough. They weren't in the game enough. There was not enough there to make you care about those characters, other than through the lens of, well, you're controlling Ellie, and she obviously knows them. The Last of Us Part 1's strong focus on a central relationship, that of course of Joel and Ellie, that grounded the story, and it provided the screen time throughout the entire plot of that game for those two characters to really grow with each other and get to know each other and to have a lot of interaction. The Last of Us 2, though, doesn't really do that, and it's actually something that's further compounded on by the main thrust of its storyline taking place over just 3 days. Now, this compressed time frame essentially does mean not that much character development happens. There's a lot of action, a lot of stuff, but not really that much meaningful development that I think hits the player in an emotional way. Many game sections, additionally, are solo, whether you're playing as Abby or Ellie, and that means no character interactions, and even though this is a very long game, it does actually feel like you don't get to spend enough time with its characters for the narrative ambitions of Naughty Dog to actually be realized, and for it to feel like they've earned the narrative punches that they try to throw at you. The pace also feels just glacial, and it actually leaves Ellie and Abby's 3 days in Seattle, I would say, just being boring, and that is both in terms of gameplay and also in terms of narrative. And I'd actually say Ellie's might even risk being more boring than Abby's section of the story, but I think the thing there is because we already like Ellie and know her as a character, it's a bit easier to stay with her. And what I will say is I really like Dinah and Ellie's relationship. For me, that was the star of the initial thrust of the story. You know, them coming to terms with the situation that they were in. I thought that stuff was all really great, and if we had seen more of that, I think I would have been having more positive general thoughts towards this game. But the thing is, the game just does not spend that much time on those characters and those humanizing elements within the context of the main thrust of the storyline outside of flashbacks, and that really does suffer. Now, when it comes to humanizing Abby's crew of characters, well, I've got to be honest with you here. Naughty Dog are so damn ham-fisted with it. They seemingly are assuming here that people don't understand that it's possible for these people to be the enemies of Ellie and to still be, well, maybe not well-meaning, but to actually be justified, to be real characters, not just things for the player to defeat. Having a well-motivated villain in your piece of media is not a crowning achievement. It should be the standard. Now, their attempt to humanize Abby, which I don't think was really needed, led to a 10-hour side quest that is just boring. Now, they go to lengths to show us the normal lives of Ellie's targets, who are Abby's friends, her crew. Do they really need to, though? That's one of the questions I was asking myself as I was going through it, because I was thinking, and look, I don't know about you, but I always assumed that the evil group in this game, that the bad guys, were just regular people put in a horrible situation, right? And they did what they did for reasons that, you know, if Joel did the same thing, you wouldn't really bat an eyelid at it. The last game actually covered this well enough, where the Fireflies had noble goals, and where Joel's decision was ambiguous at best, morally. You could see why he did it. Really, that unease felt at the end of the first game, where you, as the person who is playing Joel, felt good that you saved Ellie, but also knew, wow, I just did something selfish that pretty much doomed the human species. You know, that is such a strong moment. And, you know, for me, I actually had empathy with the doctors that Joel killed. Now, obviously, in the moment with the music pumping and the red lights of that hospital flashing, you were going to go in there and you were going to murder the hell out of those doctors, and then Marlene would come. You know what? You'd pop her too, because damn it, she was going to lead to this entire situation happening. But you knew that that was still a bad thing to do. And one of the reasons why you would know that is because, well, you're a grounded human. And I think that's basically one of the things that they messed up here. I already had empathy with those doctors. I already understood that the violence that Joel was doing was bad and that he was making a selfish decision to save Ellie. That's a decision that she would have disapproved of, but that he felt he needed to do because, well, Ellie gave him purpose. Ellie filled in the void of his daughter, who was pointlessly, senselessly murdered. And that was all incredible work, incredible narrative work from Naughty Dog. And it's actually work that I really do feel, well, kind of it does this game, right? Like, out of love, Joel does a lot of violence in the first game. In this game, out of love and loss, Ellie kind of does the same thing, as does Abby, and it's fundamentally just not that interesting. There is one thing I would like to say, though, before we hop into spoiler territory, and that is that I really had this feeling of this is a threadbare storyline that does not have much to say, that is basically just held up upon a scaffold of well-meaning, well-executed flashbacks, but that ultimately those flashbacks, that they're used as a crutch, and that they really do reveal how little meat there is to the core story of this game. And with that, let's get into spoilers. So, Joel, right? You know, tease up. Joel gets killed by Abby, right? Now, the decision is made here that Joel dies for absolutely nothing. Right? Now, he dies, obviously, because Abby wanted revenge, because it turns out that Abby is the daughter of one of the surgeons that Joel killed in the first game to save Ellie. Now, the thing is that making Joel die for nothing, what that essentially is doing is robbing the player of the conclusion that they would have wanted for that character. I think many people would agree with Joel dying. The mentor character dying is something that's pretty common, and many people will have actually wanted what I'll say is a Obi-Wan moment, right? And you know what? To actually deny people that could be potentially a very strong narrative decision. It could really drive home the pointlessness of the violence, how violence begets violence, makes everything worse, and really do some good work. But you know what's quite funny? That's actually a cop-out, because at the very end of the game, you actually find out that Joel and Ellie had began to make amends. Now, your context there was a bit of tension between Joel and Ellie, the kind of natural stuff. But eventually, well, Ellie calls Joel out on the lie, right? The lie at the end of the first game. Joel tells her the truth, and Ellie basically says, okay, I'm going back to town with you, but we're done. And you are essentially, as the player, led to believe that, yeah, the two of them were estranged, that the last thing that Joel will have thought was, sadness, that they never got to have that connection back. And then maybe Ellie would be really sad that, yeah, even though there was this terrible thing that Joel did, he had a lot of genuine emotions for, and there could have, been some sort of coming together there. You are led to believe that it is just that extremely bleak situation, when it actually turns out, they had begun to make amends, and the tragedy there is that they never got to make those amends. But I do think that that is a bit of a cop-out. I think it's a bit of narrative sleight of hand that is just really cheap. It felt like a cheap trick to get more of a gut punch emotionally at the end of the game, but it really just feels like them restructuring the narrative kind of in a way to inject that in when the core story, as it would play out linearly, just isn't really deserving of that. And I think that's kind of the weird thing. Now, overall, what I will say is that, Joel and Ellie having tensions, that's all fine. That's nice to see. It's natural when kids are growing up and around that age. And, there's things like Ellie, like in her diary, sort of fretting about, coming out to Joel and stuff like that. That's all really, really interesting stuff, and I would have loved it if that got more screen time. Ultimately, I would say, do we care about the Seraphites and the WLF, the two warring factions of Seattle? No, not really. Now, there is one other thing I do want to mention here. Yeah, what basically happens is that Joel and Tommy run into Abby, right? And they just give Abby their real names. Now, that is something that's highly out of character for Joel and for Tommy when you think about the past of those two characters and the crazy, and pretty evil stuff those guys would get up to. So them just kind of throwing all their survival skills out the window seemed pretty jarring to me, and sadly that is, it's that core mistake, Joel actually saying his name is Joel, that is what leads to the narrative happening in the way that it does. So that's what's going on with the Joel situation. Look, I think that Joel dying in this game would have been, perfectly fine. It's actually what I expected from the first game. I just don't think that Naughty Dog managed to actually get that much from it. I think it's actually impressive how little emotion, I guess emotive resonance they got from the death of Joel, especially considering the sleight of hand they needed to pull at the end of the game. So I think that is all pretty weak stuff. Now let's move over and talk about Ellie. Basically, Ellie's story is a very, very, very standard one. The protagonist has got to sacrifice everything they've got to get the one thing that they want, and really the one thing that they want is something they shouldn't want because it's bad. Vengeance. That's essentially it. Now, when it comes to cycles of violence and how that actually ties in here, it's really bizarre, actually. So, Abby and her group let Ellie live. They say they're only there for Joel, even though I think Manny does want to kill Ellie to have there be no loose ends. Then what happens is that Ellie wants to go and kill Abby, in the same way that Abby wanted to go and kill Joel. Okay, but when Ellie goes to Abby, she's trying to get to Abby via Abby's friends, right? So she's trying to get information, ask these characters, where is Abby? I need to get her. What would always happen there, though, is that Ellie would start off with a peaceful option being on the table for all of Abby's compatriots, and then Abby's compatriots would try to kill Ellie, so Ellie would have to kill them in self-defense. So then when Abby goes to Ellie and says in the theater scene, oh, you killed all my friends. We let you live. It kind of rings hollow because, Ellie tried to give your friends the same option, and they all said no and tried to kill her. So it's like, yes, Ellie kills a pregnant woman and a dog, but the pregnant woman, Mel, that she kills, it's in self-defense, right? What choice did Ellie actually have there? Yes, it was a horrible thing that had happened, but it's what Ellie needed to do. So it kind of just rang hollow to me. And then, for the dog, of course, Ellie kills a dog that attacks her. It then turns out, that was a dog that Abby really liked. And we're like, okay, well, what does that mean? Is that a commentary on anything? No, that's just pretty boring, average stuff. Yes, it is showing that the things you do can have consequences, but to be honest with you, I don't think that's particularly profound or deep. I think that is kind of standard, right? I think that's the kind of thing that you actually just think when you're playing a game anyway. That could just be me, of course. Now, Ellie does struggle with these kills afterwards, especially because, her girlfriend is pregnant, right? So, that's fine. That's interesting. Those characters having that interaction is good. It's a sort of an oops, unintended consequences of my actions thing because Ellie doesn't know that character is pregnant. And that stuff's all kind of fine. But in terms of the overall stuff that Naughty Dog wants to accomplish with Ellie killing Abby's friends, I don't really think it works that well. And then even if you translate that stuff into the gameplay, well, the game does fake surrenders all the time. So the game mechanics are consistently teaching you that actually, you know what, being nice, surrendering, having people surrender to you, that's just a bad idea. The game sort of constantly is telling you that. So it's a little bit weird how the narrative stuff just doesn't really line up as well as I think Naughty Dog thinks that it does. And then moving on, there are the disposable characters. There's guys like Jesse. Well, there's Jesse. Do we know much about him? I mean, we know a little bit about him, but you just don't care that much. He's got really, really a very low amount of screen time, and when he goes, it's like, yeah, that's it. The game treats it pretty irreverently, and you know what, so does the player, because basically, he's not that well established of a character, and you don't care. Now, as for Dinah, I think it's quite interesting. People who have not read Ellie's journal, right, absolutely read Ellie's journal when you are playing this game. It's got so much context in it, like her being worried about coming out to Joel, or, just the stuff going over Joel's head. Ellie thinking, oh, that girl's cute. Stuff like that is, the humanizing part of this game. And it's sad that it's just not there in the upfront narrative. So when you actually go through Ellie's diary, well, that's actually really good for her relationship with Dinah, and you begin to understand it a bit more. But there's very little of that between the actual two characters, and the two of them just needed more screen time. There was lots of really touching moments, like in the weed basement. I really liked that scene, but it's like, they could have done so much more and doubled down on that relationship. Then maybe we would have felt what Ellie lost at the end, but yeah, that doesn't really happen so much. So that's just a case of not really that great storytelling. And then, of course, I've got to talk about the crutch. So the core of this game, basically, as I said, is a threadbare revenge plot, and it involves loads of solo scenes with Ellie and Abby, and that basically means that you don't get that much character interaction, even though the game has an extremely long, like 30 hours, running time. I think it just feels extremely long for what the game is actually doing within its running time. Now, Naughty Dog tried to get around this with flashbacks, and I think especially the ones for Ellie are exquisitely written, right? They're great. And the ones for Abby, they're pretty good as well. They really do help to humanize Abby, I guess, but for me the thing is, I kind of already just assumed that Abby was a regular person who loved people, who wanted things. It was just a normal, rational actor. So I felt like a lot of that was just me seeing things, be put in the screen in front of me that I kind of already knew or assumed. So I think that was definitely a little bit weak, and there was probably more like subtle ways for Naughty Dog to actually tell the story of Abby without having to rely on so many of the Abby, on the Abby flashbacks. As an example of that, I think actually just showing, Ellie coming across the consequences of her actions and then feeling empathy for those people, that stuff would have been a lot more strong and probably would have let them get a lot of the same narrative weight, but in quite a bit less running time, which I think would have been a good move. Now, for that, let's just talk about the flip in characters. So, you play as Abby a lot, and the idea is to humanize her group, right? Now, this, I don't want to sound mean here, but perhaps I'm just not the sociopath that Naughty Dog thinks their audience are here, okay? Because I already thought that Abby had plenty of reason to hunt down Joel. I mean, Joel killed her dad. Obviously, Abby is going to want that. That is a totally normal, relatable human emotion. If someone did that to me, you're goddamn right, I would want to put them out, okay? So I was really not at all salty at the idea of having to play the person who killed the character that I liked, because I understood, well, yeah, of course Abby is motivated to do that. Joel killed her dad. But I was just bored with the character that I was playing and her supporting cast. And I'm just not that sure why we needed so much time put into this dull and underdeveloped cast of characters. I think they could have done a lot more light touch lampshading when it comes to giving these people a bit more, just a bit more meat to them, I suppose. And you probably could have done that without flipping to a second protagonist and then all of just the expense and time that came along with that. And as I said, yeah, if this was just, Ellie coming across the consequences of her actions, maybe Ellie kills one of that group near the start of the game, and while, maybe she's crawling through a vent, and perhaps Mel just is breaking down in tears because her best friend is dead, or something like that. And that's a way that you could have had those raw human emotions come from those characters in a way where you'd actually be experiencing them through the lens of Ellie, and you'd be questioning your actions as the player, right, when she is questioning what she has done as a character. And I think that would have been a far more effective way to have gotten those emotional beats across. I think that stuff would have been great, but instead what we got was a very ham-fisted, ponderous way of doing the story where really the emotional punch of the end of the story came from Naughty Dog purposefully withholding information from the start of the game as to the state of Ellie and Joel's relationship. I think if you have to mislead the player purposefully, even though you are playing the character, right, that's the thing. Through all of this game, Ellie knows that she and Joel have made amends, but you, the player, don't. I think if you have to rely on cheap tricks like that, you're really, really failing as a storyteller. I would then also, and yeah, I'm going to bring up this word, ludonarrative dissonance. And I get it. We've all seen years and years ago ludonarrative dissonance being rolled out by columnists left, right, and center to talk about how games have violence in them, don't you know? Maybe that's a bit weird. What would happen if Indiana Jones had the body count of Rambo? And it's like, yeah, okay, sure, we get it, but it's video games. A part of that just comes with the medium. Now, that is something that Naughty Dog wish to interrogate with this game. They give the NPCs names, right? You know, all these little things they try to do. But it all just ends up falling really, really, really flat. Now, I think it is a laudable goal, what they wanted to do there, but ultimately, like, I mean, there's one where Ellie kills one of Abby's friends, and it's a decently brutal killing scene, I suppose. It's with a pipe, whatever, and Ellie is visibly traumatized at the end. Now, the thing here is that, well, Ellie had carved her way through dozens of people before then in similarly brutal means, right? Stabbing them in the neck, just real horrible stuff. So it's like, it just doesn't really feel right as the player when you're experiencing this game as Ellie for her to go into that emotion, even though throughout the entire game, Ellie has been a cold murdering machine. So yes, ludonarrative dissonance, it's not something that I would normally bring up as a criticism, but I think because this game was so specifically trying to interrogate the violence present in its narrative, this is where it did trip up quite a bit. Now, I want to move on from this discussion to talking a little bit more about Profundity, because if you look at the reviews, it's 10 out of 10 at a lot of places, right? 10 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 9.5 out of 10. This game is, this is doing incredible things for games. There's the one reviewer who in their byline said, some video games are John Wick, this is Schindler's List. And to be honest with you, I am, after this game, I'm just thinking, what were these people smoking? I actually think that they're just being led astray by wonderful performances from the cast and a game that aesthetically feels like a well-rated TV show. I think that's basically it. I mean, hey, you got a lot of visceral violence and an unsexualized sex scene. Is that what you need for people to take you seriously? I've got to wonder, do people not get that violence comes back to bite you in the ass, right? Is this made for babies? Who is seeing what's going on here and thinking that this is an insane, profound, pushing the medium forward tale? I really don't think it is. To be honest, I mostly just felt apathy when I was going through this, chained to the wheels of characters bound to fate, right? There was nothing really that interesting happening. And it just relied on flashbacks and a cheap bit of sleight of hand at the end to get its emotional punch. I think there are so many ways that this exact same story, where Joel dies in the same manner and Ellie goes on her revenge quest and even ends up sparing Abby at the end. There are so many ways that story, which maybe is not the most interesting story that could have been told in this universe, but it still is a story. There's, I think, way more just better ways that could have been told, where things would have actually landed. And certainly with the way that Naughty Dog attempted to tell this story, the lack of choice, and this being a linear narrative, I think it really did hurt. So that's kind of what's up there. And then I guess there's also that there's just no strong emotional anchor to this game. Joel's dying should have worked better to provide that anchor, and to be honest with you, I'm kind of amazed that they did so little with it. I guess there's a bit of me that just would have wished that emotional anchor would have been Ellie growing up, that relationship with Joel being challenged and developing, and then maybe Ellie finding true love and, then the darker elements coming in. and that being the thrust of the story, I think that probably would have been a far more safe bet. So I respect them for going for the more edgy, hard to pull off version of the story, but unfortunately, I just don't think they really managed to pull it off. That reviewer brought up John Wick. I guess so much of this game is just summed up by killing strangers, the Marilyn Manson track from the soundtrack of the first John Wick. And yeah, I mean, there's just, sure, this game is raw. There's blood, right? There's a lot of visceral facial animations as characters trying to choke the life out of each other. But to be honest, for me, that's just not surprising or shocking. I mean, sure, there's excruciating detail in the violence, but I just didn't find it that relevant to the story or really relevant to my experience, because for me, I'm a very emotionally driven person when it comes to playing games. I care about the characters and where they're going through, and I guess I just quite instantly felt that dissonance and apathy. And really just this idea of killing bad being the core of the game. It's like, look, I'd like to think I'm a decently balanced person, so there's nothing that interesting being done in this game for me, right? Yeah, violence gets more violence. Everyone's terrible. You, the player, control them, and you're like, yeah, what's really being told here? What's the interest in this story? There's not that much. And then, I guess, past showing this violence, the game actually doesn't do much with it. There's a lot of talk about how this game was supposed to have people asking questions and having discussions. No, this game is boring. It's not doing anything interesting with this idea of violence begetting violence. Now, this could be that there's maybe a lot of othering and a lot of things going on in the American cultural consciousness, during the 7-year development of this game that just don't ring true with me as somebody from a different country with a different cultural experience. And it could be that somebody who's, has a similar life experience to Druckmann and the people writing this game will have had this actually impact them a bit harder. But certainly I will say for me, that stuff, the killing bad, it just didn't really ring that true. Now, moving on to other things, I mean, hate is like your core emotion of this game. I would also say, I think hate can be pretty boring, right? I think hate's actually something we all get. We all understand it pretty well because negative emotions are often what stifle us and define our lack of progress in our lives, and most of us end up interrogating our own negative emotions. And I feel like this game wants to do some of that, but basically just doesn't really do it that well. And I think the focus on that creates this experiential barrier between the player and the characters, and it's something the game never really overcomes. And maybe, this is just a core theme that they decided to go with, and perhaps they did it as best they could, but it just turned out the core theme was not as interesting as they thought it was, and they were just a bit tied to it. Maybe that's what's up there. Now, to break this into some larger thoughts, I'd actually say that a, Uncharted 4 Lost Legacy game that's focusing on Abby and Lev, I actually think that would stand more of a chance of being a well-paced experience with good characters than this game as was presented. I think that a tighter focus was needed, and that the characters of Abby and Lev are they're basically characters that could work really well. Yeah, the player might not like them because Abby killed Joel. I totally get that. But at the end of the day, Joel killed Abby's dad. We can all understand how that would motivate someone to violence. So it's just, I guess to me, it's almost insane, the missed opportunity of Abby and Lev, and how they, perhaps in trying to chase what they wanted for those characters, especially for Abby, maybe by trying to chase that so hard, they actually decrease their chances of their storytelling actually, working out that well. So I think that's unfortunate. And then the ending of the game, and the ending's really important for a game like this, as I think The Last of Us Part 1 does show us. And look, for the ending there to rely on Ellie having a flashback to a bit with Joel pretty shortly before he died that Ellie knew for the entire game, but the player didn't know. It's like, come on, there's an obvious barrier between the player and the character that they're playing there. That is obvious sleight of hand. That's obvious trickery to try to get your threadbare story to actually land harder. So I just literally disrespect. I do not respect that choice. I think that's manipulative. I think it's cheap, and I think it's lazy. And I think that really does just leave a sour taste in the mouth at the end of this game, even though I think, yes, the scene of Ellie coming back to the farm and realizing, oh, Dinah and JJ are gone and what have I done? I think that's potentially powerful, but just the misdirection it took for them to get there, I think that really did not work. So there you go. Look, I like the glimpses of who these characters were in this game. Things like Ellie's diary, you know, her nerving out over if, you know, is that girl into her? Oh, wow, what's going on with me and the tattoo artist? That stuff's cute. It's nice, right? It's warmth. You know, Ellie being into Dinah, that stuff happening, and, you know, Ellie's sexuality just totally flying over Joel's head, you know, when Joel's trying to say that Jesse's, like, into her. You know, that's really funny, right? And, you know, that's like natural, relatable growing up stuff that I think could have been, if it was more established, a strong emotional heart to this. But it just wasn't. It didn't take center stage. And that just means that this is a cold, boring game that relies on ham-fisted storytelling and sleight of hand to make its points. It is so much less competent in its storytelling than the first game was, and it's kind of astounding that it ended up like this. So there you go. I'm disappointed. And oh, by the way, guess what? It's not because there's characters that are gay. It's not because Lev is, Lev is trans, that stuff. A lot of people have been going up, harping on about how the SJWs ruined this game, blah, 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 blah. And like, look, that stuff doesn't even factor in the marketing, right? Dinah and Ellie are gay. Who cares? It's not something the game is beating you over the head with. They all, when they're going around there, they feel like just regular, believable characters. I think that people who like The Last of Us Part 1 are probably not the people who are, sort of screaming about that stuff, to be completely honest with you. And I really worry here that we end up in this problem, it's a bit like what I had with The Last Jedi, actually, where I really don't like The Last Jedi, but also I don't like it because I don't think it's a well-told story. I disagree with its structure. I think it has pacing issues and tonal issues. It's not because of that line of things, I guess. And I think it's just unfortunate because I think there's a lot of really important critiques to be made of this story and how it was told. And I really worry that the people at Naughty Dog, the Neil and co, will be able to, look at some of the critiques and just think, oh, right, this is just a bunch of salty, woman-hating, gay-hating transphobes from YouTube who hate our game. I really hope that doesn't happen. Because what I would actually say is I love those characters. Things like their sexuality, their identity, that's a part of who those characters are. And the reason why this game did not ring true with me is because those characters that I really wanted to like, I felt like they weren't really done justice by the story. So I guess that's my little soapbox to end this one on. I know that will piss off a bunch of people, but you know what? That's fine. We're all entitled to our opinion at the end of the day, and that's what my one is. And there you go. Look, for this, I didn't want to do a 15-minute review, super tightly scripted, super tightly edited. I just wanted to basically do a podcast, extended thoughts on the storytelling in this game. So, look, I know that probably killed the chances of this video doing well, but I certainly hope that you found this interesting or informative, or perhaps helped you understand how you were feeling about the game after you were done with it. So that's what's up. This is not a game review channel, of course. This is a gaming news channel. So, look, if you're interested in game news, stuff like that, then, hey, give us a sub. All that stuff's all going good. Thanks. Let me know what you thought about this story. And I suppose with that, I will see you next time.